Welcome to the CEC Report. It's March 16 and I'm Robert Barwick. And once again, welcome to Craig Isherwood, our CEC leader. Welcome,
thanks,
Craig.
Robbie. Thanks.
Okay, this week's CEC Report. World War III update. US patriots put Obama on notice. War means impeachment. Secondly, Greek default. All's quiet in the eye of the economic storm. And finally, LaRouche associate turns French presidential election upside down. So first, World War III update. US patriots put Obama on notice. War means impeachment. Following last week's intervention against the British Obama war drive to attack Iran and Syria, on the 7th of March, Republican Congressman Walter Jones tabled in the US Congress a concurrent resolution, which means it's in both houses of Parliament, and this is what it said, quote, expressing the sense of Congress that the use of offensive military force by a president without prior and clear authorization of an act of Congress constitutes an impeachable high crime and misdemeanor under Article 2, Section 4 of the Constitution, end quote. So Craig, what motivated Jones to do this?
Well, he's been part of these defence committees and so forth in the Congress, Robbie, and he became really concerned when back on March the 7th, the Senate Armed Defence Committees had a hearing, and Leon Panetta, who is the
Defence
Secretary, basically came out and said that he doesn't care about the Constitution, he's only concerned about getting international authority.
Now, to be clear, the Constitution says that only Congress has the power to authorise war.
Yeah, and Obama's just ripped that up and said, no, I can do what I like, and he did that in Libya, for example. So and I like to quote him directly because he said, this really gives you the context in which he drew this legislation up. He said, just last week, President Obama's Secretary of Defense, Leon Panetta, told the United States Senate that he only needed to seek international approval prior to initiating yet another war, this time with Syria. Congress would merely...
Just back up, international approval, not congressional approval.
That's right, international approval, right? And he continues to say, Congress would merely need to be informed. Right, and this is the basis upon which he's drawn this legislation up. He said this action would clearly be in a violation of Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. I recently took President Obama to court over this issue, as I did earlier with President Clinton. Enough is enough. It is time this country upholds the Constitution and the principles upon which this country was founded. Secretary of Defense Panetta said he's only concerned about international approval. So this is just ripping up the Constitution. And once you do that, there is no bounds. And we've always referred to, Obama as being a fascist dictator. Well, this is just another predicate for this. Very dangerous. And this is what the directionality is. So the fact that he stood up, put this resolution concurrently into both houses of the Congress, means that this is the first step for the impeachment of Obama. And Mr. LaRouche has been calling for the impeachment of Obama. Get rid of this guy and we take the threat of thermonuclear war, World War III off the table. So this is very, very important. It's being picked up by all over the country, all over the United States. We hear about nothing about it here in this country, but it is the first step of actually defeating this horrendous threat.
Now we've got another example though, a live example of just how bad Obama is. What was reported in Australia is that Benjamin Netanyahu travelled to the United States last week and gave a crazy speech at the APAC conference about ducks and nuclear power, nuclear bombs.
Of course, Netanyahu represents what we call the Jabotinsky faction within Israel, which is basically...
well, they're so bad that the original Jabotinsky was denounced by the founding father of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, as Vladimir Hitler. Yeah. And I think Netanyahu's father was his private secretary.
Yes, and he represents that faction. So that gives you a sense of where this is coming from.
Well, according to Israel's Haaretz newspaper, in its lead editorial on the 15th of March, one of Israel's leading reporters wrote that Netanyahu has gone back to Israel and he is hinting that despite the public displays of Obama's lack of support for an Israeli attack on Iran, Netanyahu is hinting that he actually in fact did get Obama's support for an attack on Iran in the form of Obama indicating to him that he will oppose it publicly, but facilitate it privately. And Craig, we've been doing this for a while now, and back in 2005, the CEC was part of an international mobilisation then against the war on Iran, which was being orchestrated by Dick Cheney, the Vice President of the United States, a man who is a sociopath. But it seems to me, in fact more than seems, it's becoming quite obvious that despite the fact that Cheney's not there anymore...
But he is advising Obama in the background.
Well, there you go. We are closer to a war now than even then.
Well, that's right. I mean, because Dick Cheney was just simply the vice president. Now we have the president pushing this sort of insane war. And of course,
the president that everyone thought would be different to Bush and Cheney.
Yeah, time for a change, I think it was.
Hope and change.
Hope and change, right? Well, no, there's no difference. Because why? Is because Obama was put into the presidency by the British monetarist empire. It was funded through the Cayman Islands, huge amounts of money, and that's still coming through. Yeah, George Soros was the conduit to do the bidding of the British Empire. So what right now is the issue on the table is the issue of World War III in order to deal, at least in a very destructive way, with the crashing financial and monetary situation. So what we have with Obama is an actual narcissistic president. He has mental problems, this guy. Mr. LaRouche has written much about it. He actually talked about it back in, I think it was 2009, that Obama was a narcissist, that he was only concerned about his own internal sense of power and how it gets expressed. And anyone that crosses his path gets annihilated, gets wiped out. Like Nero killed his own mother and killed the close people to him that tried to oppose him.
Which means, it doesn't mean that Obama's the mastermind of this. It means this is why, it's these personality traits, which is why he was picked to be this person at this time. Now, and if people don't want to take that analysis of his personality seriously, they've got to take seriously this trashing of the law. In this case, the one you just cited, what Eric Holder said last week, which is that Obama has the right as the president to kill US citizens without due process. And the last thing I wanted to raise to you on this front, Craig, is on this subject, is Australia is getting tied up in this ripping up of important legal principles, because The Age this week had a revelation that very much follows on from you. In the 17th of February, you posed a question in a press release about the Iran and Syria situation. You said, I want to know, is the Australian SAS on the ground in Syria with British Special Forces and with Al-Qaeda, because we know Al-Qaeda are in there running operations against the Assad government as well. And you said, I want to know if the Australian SAS is, and The Age this week has come out with a report that our SAS is being deployed illegally in countries in Africa for intelligence purposes out of uniform.
And this particular unit isn't supposed to even be known about.
Squadron.
Squadron 4 based, I think it's in Queenscliff here in Victoria. And this is stunning because these forces, we're going into countries we haven't declared war with. Robert.
We're assaulting their sovereignty.
Exactly, and that is a very, I mean, this is the sort of things you'd expect from the British Empire, from being part of an empire that
they don't respect anyone's sovereignty.
Sovereignty, no, they just rip it up. So this is a very worrying development, and it came out as an amazement because we were hypothesising, well, is the SAS in Syria? What are the SAS doing in Iran? Are they doing anything? I mean, any actions in those countries constitutes an act of war.
And this, and just to conclude this point, this becomes a moral question for Australians when you hear this, because if we tolerate it, one, would we tolerate it being done to us? Well, most people wouldn't. And if they wouldn't tolerate it being done to us, but would tolerate us doing it, they're worse than hypocrites. And so for those people, I pity you, but for the rest of the Australian people, when you realise this is what's happening, our country is in a bad shape, and we've got to stop this.
And I think it was also interesting that The Age reported that it was Kevin Rudd that was insisting that the SAS be deployed in Libya. And it was the Defence Minister and I think the Defence the General
David Hurley.
Yeah, David Hurley, that actually came out and said no. Now it's still going on, of course, in Africa, but it was Libya is part of Africa, but it's very, very sensitive.
Well, and I'm not even sure that just because Smith and Hurley opposed it, would that have been sufficient grounds to stop it? But
that's right.
We're looking closely at this situation. We'll report more on that in the very near future. All right, we've gone a bit over time, so we'll leave it there for now on this subject. When we return, we're going to talk about how all's quiet in the eye of the economic storm. Welcome back to the CEC Report. All's quiet in the eye of the economic storm. So, what happened in Greece last week? Now, the Greek authorities claim that they achieved their negotiated debt swap, which involved a haircut for bondholders, and it was negotiated. But most importantly, the ISDA, the International Swaps and Derivatives Association, said, well, we regard it as a default anyway. And in them making that ruling, Craig, they basically gave the green light for the credit default swap contracts to be triggered.
Yeah.
Right? Now, since then, everything's gone very quiet. But you can bet your boots that the silence is the equivalent of the eye of a cyclone, because we know there are tens of trillions of dollars worth of credit default swap contracts that will be affected by this decision in Greece. And more importantly, because these credit default swap derivatives are over-the-counter derivatives, nobody knows the full picture. In other words, the ISDA would not have ruled that it is a default and let that happen if they think it'll blow up the world derivatives market. But they don't know the real nature of the world's derivatives market. And it is very similar to what happened in Lehman Brothers in 2008. Before I pass to you, Craig, we're almost definitely seeing the impact, though, in the oil market. And why I say that is, it's very similar to 2008. Oil is being pushed up by these same speculators that dabble in these CDSs, etc., because that gives them a way to loot what's left of the physical economy to bail out their positions that are going bad in, say, Greek debt, etc. But Craig, my question to you is, the silence that we've just talked about is only in the financial markets, because on the ground in the real economy, it's actual carnage.
Well, Greece is no longer really a sovereign nation, it's an occupied country, and that's the intention of the global financial monetary system that we talk about a lot in our publications like The New Citizen. Look, what the reality is, 21% unemployment across the board
In Greece.
in Greece, 50% amongst the young people. How do you sustain an economy with those sorts of levels? I mean, the Moody's rating agency says that they don't expect that the debt ratios for Greece are going to drop below 120% of GDP until at least 2020. Robbie, so I mean, the austerity that's being pushed down the Greek people is horrendous. They're talking about cutting unemployment benefits by at least 50%. One example of a Greek steel workers, they've been on strike because they're facing a 40% cut in their wages from about 1,140 euros down to about 640. Right? You're looking at an increase in the rate of shutdown of businesses. You know, there's 27% of businesses have shut down in the last 6 months in Greece alone, in Athens within Greece alone, and it's the same in very many of the regional cities, that the austerity that's being forced upon Greece to pay this debt to these bondholders, even if has been reorganised, is literally grinding up the bodies and the souls of men and women. I mean, it's got to the point now, and people are getting to desperate measures. I heard this morning that the Greek farmers are now selling potatoes directly from the farm to the consumer, cutting the price by 50%. So the farmer's going to get his funds, and the people are going to eat. Now, this is middleman. And no middleman. So it's interesting because, you know, the market forces, the so-called free market economy, these middlemen, the likes of Coles and Woolworths in our country, are being cut out of the process. These middlemen also employ people, so you're going to see a continuation of more and more people become unemployed. So although it's so-called quiet on the derivatives front, it's like the eye of a storm as we're talking about. We haven't seen anything. The fact is, you've still got 120% of GDP, and GDP is a measure of all the goods that are within an economy.
But the fact you mentioned that I mean, they're going to keep this crushing burden on the Greek people to service a debt that effectively isn't going to change. It reminds me of what's been done to farmers now, because all farmers in Australia, Craig, effectively carry an enormous debt burden. and they can only function at a certain level that is sufficient to service that debt.
Yeah.
Right, and they're not actually getting ahead personally, etc. themselves. And they're doing this. What banks do to farmers in Australia, the international bankers are doing to the whole Greek nation. And you see why they had to replace the government with a fascist installed government, because a democratically elected government would pull the pin on this sooner rather than later.
And there's 4 monitors coming from the European Commission's economics department. They are actually monitoring all the decisions that are made by the Greek government in order to keep this bailout happening for their debt. The key thing here, Robbie, is the only solution, as we've talked about many times on this show, we've publicly talked about on our website and written about in our publications. The solution is a Glass-Steagall bankruptcy reorganisation of the model that Franklin Roosevelt brought in, where you actually exert sovereignty as a nation and you say, to hell with the debt that is speculative, we'll protect the debt that is real, we'll reorganise it through a credit system, and then we'll put people to work through very large-scale infrastructure development projects. And it's a directed political decision to do this. It's got nothing to do with finance. Finance and money are irrelevant. What is important here to recognise is the question of sovereignty being exerted is a political decision. And that's what we face in our own country, with all the issues that come up recently with the Future Fund and discussions of how do we manage our investments. Well, if they're managed by a private monetary system, we're going to get looted blind. We're going to be paying more taxes, more tariffs, we're going to sell off more infrastructure. If you have a Glass-Steagall orientation, which is a sovereign orientation, then these people get wiped out. These parasites get put to death, we got rid of. So they can't affect the real physical economy. And that's a political decision every country on the face of this earth is facing today. And it's a political one, not a financial one.
Yeah, because if in the case of the Future Fund, for example, in Australia, the debate has been who should be the chairman of it, when the real question is, whoever the chairman is, what hope does the poor bugger have?
That's right. In a monetary system, you're going to lose it because there's no protections for that by the government. It's basically market forces can prevail and do what they like, and if they lose the money, that was a market forces. Exactly what we're seeing in Greece: market forces, free trade, privatisation, sell off of state assets in a big way. Where do the people fit in? Well, they don't.
And I think Craig, Anna Bligh signed a political death warrant last night because she stood there and defended what she did to Queensland in the asset sale program, similarly to what's happening in Greece.
Yeah.
And if there's one thing that's turned the people of Queensland against Anna Bligh, it's that program.
That's right. I mean, it's coming down to that this is now an issue in an election. Well, it's going to get more and more like that at the federal and at the state elections, because people are feeling the effects of the looting that comes when you sell off publicly owned assets.
All right, well, so let's just leave it at that. When we return, we're going to have an interesting discussion about how LaRouche's associate in France is shaking up the French presidential election. Welcome back to the CEC Report. And so finally, LaRouche associate Jacques Cheminade shakes up the French presidential election. Craig, your counterpart in France, the equivalent of you, his name is Jacques Cheminade, is the national political leader of an organisation there which is associated with Lyndon LaRouche, like the CEC is here in Australia. He is contesting, again, the French presidential election, and this time around he's probably having the biggest impact he's ever had. So in the time we've got left, let's just talk about that campaign. Tell the viewers what's going on there.
Well, Jacques has basically surprised the British and the establishment, in particular the French establishment, because he has been able to get onto the presidential ballot. Now, this requires the endorsement of 500 elected officials in France. There's about 10,000. These are local mayors and the like. And Jacques has had 500 of these, actually more than that, mayors, sign for his candidacy as a presidential candidate.
And so that's a pretty big deal. They've got to publicly endorse him to be a presidential candidate.
Yeah, and it's one of the points of attack. How could Jacques Cheminade get all these people? Well, Jacques' response to that is, well, these people are intelligent.
Well,
Because why? Look, you got a mass strike within France, like you have within every country. The mayors are at the front line. Like you imagine the towns that are being flooded now in the Murray-Darling Basin. The mayors are the ones that stand up and they take responsibility if you're trying to save things. Well, the mayors of France are facing the same thing, and they say this system isn't working. We're being smashed. We need an alternative. Our alternative is Jacques Cheminade. And Jacques has been around for a long time. In 1974, he met Lyndon and Helga LaRouche in the United States. He was actually the trade attaché at the French embassy in the United States. So he met the LaRouches back in 1974. So what you have is LaRouche's policies, publicly identified, coming in at the highest level of office in France. This is the Glass-Steagall, right? This is the development of large-scale infrastructure development projects. This is dealing with the private banks and shutting down speculation.
And because Jacques been around so long and run before, that's given him credibility in this campaign, especially on economic issues.
Robbie, he's absolutely been smashed in the past, nearly bankrupted personally because of the actions of the past French governments. You know, there's a report come out just in the last couple of days where Nicolas Sarkozy is being investigated for accepting $50 million worth of money from none other than Colonel Gaddafi from Libya, because they were great mates.
Back in his 2007 campaign.
In his 2007 campaign. And who was it that led the murder attempt, or the murder of Gaddafi? It was Sarkozy. Right, so this is the level. I mean, you're dealing with these sorts of, corruption.
So the French people are looking at the smorgasbord of candidates, and one guy is starting to stick out as having a bit of integrity and credibility.
And what's funny is that when they try and slander Jacques, using what is seemingly off-the-wall policies, like the policies of controlling international finance and these sorts of things, he's actually winning support. So their slanders are actually winning the people's support, because the situation has got so bad in the world, and particularly in France, that Jacques is starting to stand out by the very policies that he's always stood for. And, you know, in one particular case, once he announced his candidacy, I mean, the hits on the website, and on the internet, I should say, increased 2,400% within the space of a couple of days. So Jacques sees himself, as he said when he launched his campaign, I am in the spirit of June 1940. And this is when Charles de Gaulle went to England to find support for the resistance to fight against the fascists. So what Jacques is doing, and it's completely lawful, is identifying with this deep current within the French population of nationalism to fight against the foreign, British influence and the destruction of his country. It's very much like how we invoke the memories of Ben Chifley, of John Curtin, to fight against the British currents within our country, because Ben Chifley took on the banking system during the war and actually tried to nationalise the banks. John Curtin, of course, turned away from Britain when Australia was at its greatest peril and looked towards the United States, and struck up a tremendous relationship with General Douglas MacArthur, and of course it was Franklin Roosevelt in the background, whereby these two men helped actually save Australia. If that didn't come into play, then we would not be here today.
And I urge viewers, if you get a chance, to go to our website, or the LaRouche PAC website, and watch. There's a video on Jacques' campaign that'll give you a live sense, and especially look at it from the standpoint, people think about the CEC and a lot of people support our views, etc., but there's a certain pessimism because of what Bob Catter calls the Coles and Woolies form of politics in Australia, where you think that the two major parties are so all dominant there'll never be an alternative voice. Well, Jacques is our equivalent over there, and he's breaking through that. So have a look at that. But we've run out of time, so we'll leave it there. As usual, get involved with us. We're campaigning for the important things. Tune in next week for more.